In this video, we're going to take a look at Pilot 100th Anniversary Light Blue. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a light blue. Now, to be really fair to what's going on, and I'm going to have to make sure it's good in post, it shows up much better to my eye than it does on camera. So don't be completely discouraged if it's harder to see as you're looking at this. Now, while I can read it easily, it does cause a little bit of eye fatigue. I wrote strain, but I really think it's fatigue over an entire page of writing. It shades fairly well most all of the time, which you can really expect for the fact that it is very light, and a lot of light inks tend to shade very well. This one does also. But it's shading from a very light blue to a mid-tone blue. It gives a bunch of tone variation depending on the pen that you choose to put it into, which means if you find the tone itself to be a bit too light for your liking, there's always the chance that you have a pen that will put down that darker tone for it, so it doesn't become a loss. That being said, I did purchase a couple bottles of their 100th anniversary inks, not a couple bottles of this one, thankfully, because I don't know that I would really go back to use this ink in the future, but it does make me happy to have tried it out, because otherwise I would have felt rather lacking with as many inks that have been looked at here. It's not bad. It's just not for me. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a TWSBI Vac Mini with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine nib has no feathering, no spread. It is shading, but the shading that's there, we can easily see. It's just that it's going from a very light tone to a lighter mid-tone. You see it all the way across in substance, where it goes from darker to lighter and back and forth constantly. Merely goes from lighter to darker. By is a very light word the whole way through. It's just that it's shading from light to a bit darker. The medium is darker than the fine, but just a little bit. It has no feathering, no spread. The shading that we see is just as good as the shading that's been going on in the fine, so doing very well there. Now, this broad nib is very wet as a nib, and it's got no feathering and no spread, much darker tone, much nicer on the page for me. Now, the thicker lines also help show some of that off. It's still shading very well. It's not sacrificing in that way. It's not shading as much, though, and that's the very wet pen. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Tornado with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We get a little bit of shading, not as much shading as we did get on the Clairfontaine, but as has been normal, it's a more absorbent paper, so we can kind of expect that. This light blue does become a bit turquoise leaning as a color because of the toned paper. Medium is the same tone as the fine. It has no feather, no spread. It still offers some shading, so it's doing fairly good when it comes to that. The broad is about the same tone that we're seeing with the medium and the fine. It has no feathering, no spread. I think the shading is much nicer here, much easier to see, much more stand out. Still a very turquoise leaning light blue, but I think it's very nice in how it's being accomplished here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get some light ghosting and no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread. Moleskine has been really pulling the stops out. I'm just going to say it every single time here, probably. We're getting some shading, which is not very common on this paper. It's not too bad. Now, we're getting that same turquoise leaning color, which is two things that are happening. One is the more absorbent paper. The other is the cream color with that light blue is giving us that turquoise. Now the medium is the same tone as the fine with no feather, no spread, a couple spots of shading that do show up. As you can see, the dot of publication is a bit darker. When I went back over in the word audience and fixed the U, going back over in that area made it much darker, but it's also going to be interesting to see if it bleeds. The broad is a little bit darker than what we're seeing in the fine and the medium. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It is showing some shading in a fairly decent way. Look at the T in subject. Look at the H and the D in 100. Not too bad in what's happening here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get a very minor ghosting, which is not unusual being a light ink, but no bleed at all. Not even in that area where I went back over the U. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We are getting some shading here. Now, it is a little lighter than we got on the Clairfontaine as a tone, but it's still basically readable, but it looks very faded as a color. I wouldn't call it a light blue, I would call it a faded blue. It does have a couple of moments that shading does show up, but nothing really stand out. Just the top of the T in credited, just the T in mathematics, the H in mathematics, but not tons of it. That Y. Now, I didn't see the halo show up anywhere else, but it did show up there, so I guess this ink could do it. Looking at the back of the page, we get almost no ghosting, not a surprise with that, and no bleed through at all. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Billy Eckstein Blues for Sale. Here is Diatramensis Pigeon. Here is Diamine China Blue. Here is Geherban Bleu Provence. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feathering. We get no spread. We are getting some shading, only a little bit. It's there. It's nothing special, but I want to call it very subtle. And at this point, I'm almost thinking of it as an elegant, because the H in health starts a little bit darker and it works its way a little lighter and a little bit darker again at the H. So it's here and it's performing nicely. Medium is just a step darker than the fine. It has no feather, no spread. Again, some of that very gentle shade is actually here, which is not common for this paper at all. The broad nib is about the same tone, maybe a little bit darker than the medium, just a tad, with no feather, no spread. Both of those were kind of surprising here. We do get shading. You'll see it in the word lifetime. You'll see it in the word from. You'll see it in the word for. So doing very well on a very inexpensive paper. When we look at the back of the page, we see that we get normal amounts of ghosting. It's getting deep into the page, but not too deep, and it's nowhere near touching the page underneath, so it's not bleeding at all. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a red ink by Colorverse, their Season 1 Lights on Series. Here is a shimmering magenta ink by Diamine, their Magenta Flash. Here's a brown ink by Pelikan, their Edelstein Smoky Quartz, the 2017 Ink of the Year. Here is a black ink by Rhodia Klinger, their Document Black. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get some tiny feathers. Not something that's a huge deal, but it is definitely there, making a couple spots look a little bit blurrier, like in the spots where it gets a little bit darker. Both of the H's in healthy, for instance, have quite a bit more of the tiny feathers at the slightly darker areas. So you can get some moments of shading, but with that comes decreased performance. Medium is about the same tone as the fine. It is feathering, very small. It is got a tiny bit of spread, but barely noticeable, really. And no real shading. It's just feathering for the sake of feathers on this paper. The broad is about the same tone as the medium. Does it feather? Yes, constantly. But this is cheap paper. It's just all over to the point of giving it a blurry look. What is it? Ingestion as a word is entirely blurry. If I didn't read it, I wouldn't be entirely sure. It's not great, and I even stumbled with it. Looking at the back of the page, we see how deep that ink is, causing a lot of show through, and we see I circled spots where it did touch the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? With this being a very light blue, and it's not that I don't like it, it's that the tone itself isn't what's really what I think of that I go to. Now, a really wet pen for me is needed to get a little bit darker. I don't need it to be super dark, but just a little bit darker would make it more easily to read on the page. Something like a very wet medium pen. Now, casually writing just your own notes or your own journal entries type thing, I don't see any kind of a problem with this unless you're one of those people that writes 6, 7, 97 pages at a time. Then you may find this ink too light to use comfortably. So use the wetter pens if you need to be able to go back on full pages of reading. Thanks for watching.